Hello, this is the first of a short sequence of videos going through the final steps in finishing your dissertation. I'm going to start by sharing the Moodle page with you, and you'll find links to all of the material you need on Moodle. So I've gone straight in here to session 7. So this session 7 is going to be about thinking critically about your methods and data. And just note that as well as the slides which I'm going to go through, there are also a couple of other videos which I think you may find useful. The first one is from Lawrence Bland, looking at what critical thinking is. And that's a question that I've been asked on a number of occasions. So I think looking at that, you may find that helpful. And also I've added a link to a video from Canada, which looks at how you might think about research data and how you might apply that kind of critical thinking to how you look at your own data. And when I talk about data, I'm talking about the stuff you get from your participants. So it's well worth looking at those. I'm just going to come back again. And now I'm going to run through the slides for session 7, which is here. So again, this is emphasizing thinking critically. Please note those two links to videos about what critical thinking might involve, and remember that thinking critically isn't about thinking negatively. When you're thinking critically in the context of academic thinking, you are questioning. You are ensuring that the statements that you are making are backed up by your research or backed up by literature. You're making sure that you are logical. You're making sure that you are presenting your ideas clearly, so ensuring that the reader can understand what you're talking about. So often thinking critically involves writing in the simplest way, not using complex language, but writing using simple language to express complex ideas. That's just a reminder. You know, you've been through the Viva already. You've got your dissertation hand and date coming up in May. So this is where you might be now. You may be beyond this. You may not be at this point yet, but I've got a sense that some of you will be at the point where you've identified your research methods, and you may be just about to start your practical research. You may have already carried out your practical research. That's absolutely fine. This is still relevant to you. I'll just make the point there that if you think critically about your methods and the data that may emerge, that will help you to sharpen your focus. So here, what are you trying to do? So it's worth thinking now about what is your research question and what will your results tell you? And I'm using this example, I've used this several times before, my hypothetical research into Year 4 pupils' views on geography lessons. So in my hypothetical research, I'm trying to find out, I'm trying to answer this question: what are Year 4 pupils' views on geography lessons? Okay, so my results are going to give me Year 4 pupils' views on geography lessons. It's as simple as that. Therefore, I need to be asking them questions, Year 4 pupils, questions about how they feel about geography. The connection is that logical. If my research were into something like teachers and their views about play in the early years, my research is going to give me teachers' feelings about play in the early years. That's what I'm looking for. That's my data. If I am looking at my question is something to do with the effective approaches to supporting pupils on the autistic spectrum, then my data from my participants will indicate the types of approaches that practitioners use and a sense of which of these approaches they feel are effective. So the results essentially are answering my research question. Thinking about your work more broadly, so in the discussion section, and I've talked to you before about combining the results and the discussion in a single section or a single chapter called results and discussion, or findings and discussion. Okay, that makes sense to me. It's a more concise way of presenting your findings. It means that you don't end up repeating your findings in the discussion section, having already presented them in your findings section. So if you combine the two sections together, it's a more concise approach. But in the discussion section, there are a number of points you need to consider. You need to think about the difficulties that you came across as part of your experience of carrying out the research. And those difficulties can be the types of difficulties that researchers always face. But this year there may be additional layers of difficulties to do with COVID, for example. So you can discuss those types of challenges and discuss how they affected your plan of work. You know, how did you adapt your approach in order to ensure that your research was successful? Another thing to consider in your discussion section is the limitations that apply to your research. So it may be that you had a limited number of responses. Perhaps in your original research plan, you were expecting to get participation from 8 or 9 or 10 participants, and when it came down to it, you only got the participation of 3 or 4 or 5 participants. So what does that mean in terms of your research? How has that limited your research? What impact has that had on the strength of your results? Were there time constraints? So did COVID and the approach you had to use for carrying out your research, did that make a difference to your research? So did you have less time to explore in detail ideas of participants because you were working online and maybe there were limited availability? It might happen the other way around, of course, because working online may have maximized the time available to have discussions. I don't know. That's the kind of thing that you can discuss in your discussion section. Bias. Are you conscious of elements to do with bias in your findings? So, for example, on reflection, do you feel that your questions to participants maybe kind of push them in a particular direction? Did the questions that you asked, did it narrow the possibilities for responses from your participants? So did you unconsciously introduce elements of bias into your research methods? So this is an opportunity for you to reflect and write on this in the discussion section. And then you're also looking at the strengths and weaknesses of your data. So how effectively did you answer your research question? How effectively did you focus on your research question? How thoroughly have you answered your research question? You might want to think about whether your research question it ended up being quite broad and your findings are quite narrow. So there might be a difference. You might have ended up through your methods have ended up with quite a tight focus that isn't didn't kind of recognize the breadth of your original question. That's okay. That's just, but it's about you showing an awareness of that. Are there weaknesses of your data? This goes back to ideas like bias. So, for example, in your interviews, if you carried out interviews, did you use a lot of closed questions, which had the effect of narrowing the types of responses you got from your participants? It kind of forced them in a certain direction because the only option they had was to say yes or no. And perhaps more open-ended questions would have given you a greater range of responses. Okay. And then, to what extent does your data support your proposition? So you're making some conclusions at the end of your research. You're drawing some conclusions to do with the research question that you started off with. So, for example, if your research question was about pupils' attitudes towards geography lessons, has your data answered that question? Does it give you a conclusive, if you like, a certain answer, or is the answer uncertain? Is there room for doubt? And I've talked before about the idea of doubt and uncertainty being a good thing. So it's okay to recognize that your research doesn't give you an absolute conclusive answer to your research question. There are some gaps there. It's not certain, and explain why it's not certain. Explore that. Think about it and explore that by writing about that in your discussion section. So if things don't go according to plan, don't cover it up, explain. Research very, very rarely goes according to plan, and it's researchers' ability to recognize that and present that to the reader that provides evidence of critical thinking. It's a good thing. So that comes from Gretham. Right, generalizability and relatability. So generalizability is about the extent to which your findings apply to other pupils and or teachers in other settings. So you will have carried out your research probably with pupils in one particular setting, or with teachers or with parents linked to one particular setting. If your findings are generalizable, that means you could also apply what you have found with those particular pupils or those particular parents or teachers in that particular setting. You could apply those findings to other settings. If that's the case, your findings are generalizable. Relatability is about the extent to which people in other settings can learn or benefit from your research. So, if you were carrying out your research with pupils at a particular special educational needs setting, and those pupils are autistic, could teachers at another SEN setting working with autistic learners look at your research and learn something about their own practice from reading your research? Okay, so it's the idea of somebody who you've not had anything to do with reading your research, which relates to school A in London, and they work in school B in Leeds, but they read your research and it means something for them. They can apply your findings to their day-to-day practice in Leeds, although it's a different place, geographically a different place, it's a long way away. They haven't worked with the pupils that you have worked with, but they may be able to see some something that's relatable to their own practice. Okay, generalizability, relatability. So, and how would you write about that? Well, here's an example in italics. Obviously, you're not going to use italics. I'm just putting that as an example of how you might write about this in your dissertation. The findings of my research are not generalizable. However, my findings may be useful to practitioners in other early years settings with a high proportion of children with English as an additional language. To some extent, my findings may be relatable. Okay, so that's that last bit is just an example of the type of language that you might use in your discussion section when writing about generalizability and relatability. Validity. Okay, so when we're talking about validity, we're talking about the idea that a particular instrument, now when I'm saying an instrument, I'm talking about your research tool, for example, a questionnaire, a survey, an interview, a demonstration that a particular instrument in fact measures what it purports to measure. So when something purports to do something, it's something that it's planned to do. Basically, does it do the job you wanted it to do? So if you have used questionnaires to answer your research question, has that use of questionnaires effectively enabled you to measure the thing that you're trying to measure? In qualitative data, validity might be addressed through the honesty, depth, richness, and scope of the data achieved, the participants approached, the extent of triangulation. So triangulation is when you are using more than one source to build your data, and the disinterestedness or objectivity of the researcher. If you are disinterested, that doesn't mean that you are uninterested or not interested. The word disinterested means you have not got any kind of bias. It means that you are able to be objective about the question. You're kind of entering it with a clean slate. You're not bringing any assumptions to your research. You're approaching it with an open mind. It is impossible for research to be 100% valid. So the point here is, even if you've got an amazing research instrument, you've really thought of it very, very carefully, it's not possible for that instrument that you've used, that method that you've used, to absolutely 100% measure the thing that you were trying to measure. And last point here, the subjectivity of respondents. In other words, respondents have their own interests and their own characteristics. The subjectivity of respondents, the opinions, attitudes, and perspectives together contribute to a degree of bias. Validity should be seen as a matter of degree rather than an absolute state. So we can't say it's very difficult, or according to Cohen et al., it's impossible for your research to be 100% valid. So it's a degree of validity. So for you, to what extent, to what degree do you feel your research is valid? To what extent were you able to fully, successfully answer your research question using the tools that you did? And here again, as before, as an example of the type of language that you could use for this section. This again is in your discussion, of course. I attempted to increase the potential validity of my research by interviewing a range of practitioners in the setting. I felt that by interviewing teachers, teaching assistants, and the deputy head teacher, my data would be richer than if I interviewed teachers only. I also felt it was important to avoid carrying out research in the class my nephew attends in order to. So obviously, you know, avoiding a situation in which your sort of personal responses might get in the way is something to think about. However, I do recognise that, as Cohen et al. Argue, it is impossible for research to be 100% valid. Note that's a direct quote there, so obviously you need the year and the page number. While I encouraged teachers to be frank in expressing their views, it is possible that. So, you know, you might say to teachers or your participants, I want you to be really honest with me. It doesn't matter what you say, just be honest with me. Even then, even if you ask your participants to do that, you're still relying on them to be as honest and frank as you want them to be. You don't know. You don't actually know what's going on in their head. All you've got is what they say, which means it's very difficult. It's impossible, without being able to read people's minds, which we can't do, to be 100% certain about their responses and how they match up to your research. Triangulation, I mentioned that a little bit earlier here. So triangulation, in qualitative data, validity may be addressed through the use of triangulation. That's back to Cohen again. So Cohen is a good source that you can use actually in your methodology, but also in your discussion section. Cohen et al. Define triangulation as the use of two or more methods of data collection in the study of some aspect of human behavior. So it might be you're using different tools. You might be using questionnaires and interviews, or you might be interviewing or using the same type of tool with different types of participants. So you may be using observations and interviews of pupils, or you may be using surveys of teachers and interviews with some teachers. So that would give you that triangulation. Triangular techniques attempt to map out the richness or complexity of human behavior by studying it from more than one standpoint. So that's what triangulation is about. It's kind of from that idea of finding fixed points by using various angles. It's kind of mapping term. Cohen et al. State exclusive reliance on one method may bias or distort the researcher's picture of the particular slice of reality being investigated. So if you have only used one method, it's important that you recognize that by using only one method, your findings may be distorted. Discuss this in the discussion section. And here's an example here. Again, the sort of language you might use. In order to triangulate my research, I used three methods of data collection, etc., etc., etc. You go on and discuss that. My intention was to minimize the potential for bias and to increase the extent of validity in my research. Again, this is something you would discuss in the discussion section. And a final term to think about is the term reliability. Reliability in quantitative research, and some of you will be thinking in terms of quantitative research and some of you in qualitative research. So quantitative is if you're dealing with numbers, basically. Reliability in quantitative research is essentially a synonym. It means the same as dependability, consistency, and replicability, meaning that you could do the same thing in a different situation and get the same type of results. For research to be reliable, it must demonstrate that if it were to be carried out on a similar group of respondents in a similar context, then similar results would be found. So if I carry it out with one group of 7-year-olds in one mainstream primary school, and I find these results, those results are reliable if I know that I could take that same research method and apply it to a different group of 7-year-olds in a different mainstream primary setting, and I know I'll get the same results or similar results. in other words, if you were to carry out your research with another similar group of respondents, teachers, pupils, parents, in a similar context, how similar would your findings be? How reliable? So that's a very specific, that word reliable means something very specific in the context of research. Note, quantitative research assumes the possibility of replication. If the same methods are used with the same sample, then the results should be the same, according to Cohen. This is about quantitative research, so research involving numbers, percentages. Qualitative research. Two researchers studying a single setting may come up with very different findings, but both sets of findings might be reliable. This is an interesting thing because in terms of qualitative research, you'd be looking at surveys or interviews, for example. You're getting some stuff from your participants. Two researchers looking at the same words, the same quotes from participants, could interpret them in different ways, but both of those interpretations could be reasonable. So in a sense, the data is reliable. Both findings are reliable, but they're contradictory because different people will interpret what people say in different types of ways, which is interesting. There may be as many different interpretations of the qualitative data as there are researchers. So 3 different researchers may look at the same responses and interpret them in 3 different ways, etc., etc. So just recognize that. Kind of one of the things that this is indicating is that your interpretation of your data isn't the only interpretation possible. Other people could look at the same data and could interpret it in a different way. So you've got to be when you're presenting your findings, be aware of that. Be aware that this is your interpretation of the data and that others might interpret it differently. Here's an example here. This is kind of quite a famous example here. Study of Nissan car factory. Wickens found in '87 found organisation practices that demonstrated flexibility, teamwork, and quality consciousness, whereas the same practices were investigated by Garahan and Stewart. 5 years later, and they found a vicious circle of exploitation, surveillance, and control, respectively. That's interesting, isn't it? So, 2 sets of qualitative researchers found incredibly contrasting things about a particular setting. Okay. Minimizing bias. So you may have already done your interviews, and that's fine. This is something you could think about in terms of how you went about doing your interviews. If you are still to do your interviews, if you're doing interviews, these are some things to think about. So things that contribute to bias: the attitudes, opinions, and expectations of the interviewer. So think about, if you were using interviews, how could your attitudes or opinions have got in the way of objectivity? Is it possible that you could have asked questions in a biased way? Another issue from Cohen, the interviewer might tend to see the respondent in their kind of as like them. So as the interviewer thinks of, they're talking to a teacher, and when the teacher says something, they think, well, if I was saying that, this is what I would mean. So you're kind of seeing your participant in your own image. More obviously, a problem with bias is where the interviewer looks for answers to support a preconceived notion. So you go into the interview having already decided what your findings are, and what you're looking for is for participants basically to agree with you. You're looking for responses that back up the conclusions that you want to make. And that's not what research is about. Research is about challenging your own perceptions and gathering data which genuinely answer research questions. Another problem, misperceptions on the part of the interviewer of what the respondent is saying. So the respondent may say something, your interpretation may be a misunderstanding of what the respondent is saying. Okay. And finally, there might be a problem that the respondent doesn't really understand what you are asking. So you ask a question and the respondent answers, but their understanding of your question is not accurate, and actually they end up answering a different question, or a question which they haven't fully understood. So these are problems that potentially face all researchers, and just think about these in terms of your own research and how this might impact on your own research. And reflect on these and write about this in the discussion. So ask yourself these questions. When you're thinking about your discussion, ask yourself, to what extent might people in other settings learn from your research? That's about relatability. To what extent have you increased or managed to secure honesty, depth, and richness in your data? That's about validity. To what extent have you gathered data from other standpoints, from more than one standpoint or more than one angle? And then finally, if you were to carry out your research with another similar group of respondents, teachers, pupils, parents, in a similar context, how similar would your findings be? Okay. And note that these are all open-ended questions. These aren't yes/no questions. These are questions which ask you to reflect critically on your approach to research. And finally, there's a question there about bias, and thinking about whether how clear of bias you were in your research. How did you minimize the possibility of bias in your research? And there are references there set out as you should set out your reference list.